I want to respond to some past testimony at this committee regarding my conduct as a leader. I was surprised and deeply saddened by the allegations. I have always strived to foster an inclusive, supportive, and respectful workplace, and to conduct myself with the same values of integrity, empathy, and kindness that I look to instill in my 3 young daughters. These allegations were thoroughly reviewed by McCarthy Tétrault, and their final conclusions on these matters are on the public record. I want to close my remarks by wishing all of the talented and dedicated colleagues I work with at SDTC the very best as they transition to the National Research Council. I will continue to support them and the new board in fulfilling their mandate to ensure the transition is as smooth as possible for my exceptional colleagues and the entrepreneurs and small business owners that SDTC supports. I welcome your questions.
Much, Ms. Kolbuc. We'll now begin our first round, which will consist of 4 members with 6 minutes each. Mr. Perkins, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witness, for coming. You oversaw the seed fund, which the Auditor General found was essentially illegal outside of the contribution agreements. In other words, the fence posts that the government set up that allowed the spending of taxpayer dollars at SDTC. Who created the seed fund? Whose idea was it?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. The seed fund was a funding stream that was established in 2019. And so the strategic direction for the foundation was set by the board, and then the funding stream was established under that direction.
Thank you. And then, so the board set it up, and the board members selected as the screening mechanism for a lot of those projects companies they either sat on the board and are chaired, like the Verschuren Center. Is that correct?
So, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there was approximately 85 different partners that SDTC worked with. And so those partners would nominate companies for funding. And then those nominations would go through an eligibility screening process. And so a nomination
I've read the documents. That wasn't my question. My question was that you had accelerators set up to review these things. Did you not, like the Verschuren Center?
No, it was staff that would review the projects for eligibility. And then had they met the eligibility criteria that was set up for the seed funding stream, the companies would then go forward to a panel of experts that would review them. Then the recommendations would be made to the project review committee. The project review committee would then recommend projects to the board of directors.
Okay, who did you report to?
I reported to the former CEO, Leah Lawrence.
So you worked then in parallel with the current acting COO, whatever they're calling him, Zaid, the former or VP of Investments?
Sorry, is that a question?
Yeah. So you worked with parallel? Is that correct?
Oh, yes, yes.
So,
yes.
so
Ziad Rami was my peer, and he held the role of Vice President Investment.
Right. So there are a number of emails when the consideration was being put forward for $6.8 million for the Verschuren Center from the board. There are a number of emails from him to the team, which I think includes you, fast-tracking their application. In fact, on July 30th, 2021, the subject says, Verschuren Center request to fast-track proposal. So who would have told him to fast-track that proposal?
So, oh gosh. So I guess your question is, who would have told him to fast-track? I would expect I'm trying to remember because I know Ziad addressed this at the committee before. So there's about 6 steps in the application process. So a fast track would be that the information collected on the project was sufficient and they didn't need to gather additional information on the project.
He makes the determination to fast track it.
That would be the decision of the Vice President Investment,
Okay.
would agree to fast track it. But it doesn't necessarily mean the project moves faster through the approval process. It just means that there's sufficient information to proceed to the next step.
Fair enough. So the Verschuren Center was turned down for obvious conflicts of interest. It's shocking to me that it ever made it anywhere, even through a consideration process. It was turned down. But the same Vice President, in a letter in January 2022, said that they would use staff at SDTC to find money elsewhere in the government. Do you think it's the right thing for, it was the right thing for the employees of SDTC to essentially be the business development arm, finding government money for a center which was set up by the chair of the board?
It's my understanding that the Verschuren Center asked SDTC to not support them in finding any additional funding streams after their project was denied.
Not what happened.
It was never fun.
But that's not what happened. That's not what happened. According to the Vice President of Investments, yes, they did, in fact, help find them almost $11 million. Was that a regular occurrence where board member companies were being used or helped by staff to find other government funding for their projects?
So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I worked with a team of ecosystem leads, and their mandate was to support
Well, yes or no. It's a simple yes or no. I don't need a repeat of your opening remarks. Yes or no. Did board member companies that they had investments in regularly use the staff of SDTC to find other government money for their companies? Yes or no?
So what I was trying to answer is that the team at SDTC always put support for companies as the primary focus of the work that they did. If that meant a company was not a fit for SDTC's mandate, they would make recommendations based on their knowledge of the ecosystem of other places where companies could go to receive funding. So that was part of the work that the ecosystems team would do.
Thank you very much. That is your time, Mr. Perkins. Mr. Cooper, you're going to lead us off for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Kolbuc, I'm going to ask you some questions with respect to the application for funding by the Verschuren Center. When the decision was made not to move ahead with the funding application, the then VP of Investments and current COO, Mr. Rami, on January 18, 2022, wrote to the Verschuren Center and stated that SDTC would give best efforts to help the Verschuren Center secure funding from other government departments and agencies, notwithstanding the obvious conflict of interest that Annette Verschuren was chair of SDTC and at the same time was the founder of and sat on the board of directors of the Verschuren Center. It was her personal vanity project. So who was it, whose decision ultimately was it to direct staff to undertake efforts for the Verschuren Center to receive government funding from other departments and agencies?
So as I responded earlier, I did kind of look up that email that you had mentioned and subsequent emails. And, you know, just to remind myself, it was a while ago and I was unfortunately experiencing an episode of long COVID, which had me not at work in part of that time period. But what I do recall is that the Verschuren Center had actually asked SDTC to not support them in finding funding after receiving news that their project with SDTC was not going to be moving forward.
Well, that's inconsistent with the testimony of Mr. Rami, who wrote the letter on January 18th, and when he was asked about it, he conceded or based on his testimony, that efforts were made. Why wouldn't he have said that no efforts were made if, in fact, that were the case?
I mean, when you're at these committees, there's many, many questions coming at you. You're trying to remember quite an expanded period of time. We certainly, based on that email that you shared, the offer would have been made, but whether or not the offer was accepted, it's my recollection that it was not accepted for SDTC to provide support to that center.
And on what basis do you draw that recollection? Was there a letter? What communications were there between the Verschuren Center and with whom? What do you have to substantiate that? Because it's completely inconsistent with what we've heard.
Yeah, I can look and see what I can do to further substantiate that and follow up with the committee with that information.
Now, it also contradicts the testimony of the whistleblower, who stated that unprecedented efforts were made to help secure funding for the Verschuren Center. So are you stating to this committee that the whistleblower misled or flat out lied to this committee? Is that your position?
My goal at this committee is to ensure that I provide fulsome responses to the questions I'm being asked based on my recollection of what happened at the time, because I know this matter is of utmost interest to this committee, and I want to ensure that I fulfill my duty and roles in responding to all of the questions that you were putting forward with the most fulsome answer that I can.
Thank you for that. And I want to go back to a question that Mr. Perkins posed to you, and that is, how often did SDTC staff assist board members, companies, or projects in which board members had interests in to secure funding from other government departments and agencies, as Mr. Rami offered to do on behalf of the Verschuren Center? How often did that happen?
So I was never contacted by any board member about a project that was being considered for funding. What I did provide in my response to your colleague was that SDTC did, and my employees and the staff at SDTC did work within that whole of government approach to providing support for clean technology companies. So we would make referrals to other funding agencies, other programs, provincial partners.
And those, sorry to interrupt, those referrals happened in certain instances where board members had conflicts. They were board members' companies. They had interests in those companies. SDTC staff, you're confirming, did assist projects where there were those types of conflicts. Is that correct?
So I'm based in Calgary, Alberta, right? So oftentimes there might be an applicant that was looking for funding, and the project that they had could have been a better fit for a program under Natural Resources Canada. So we would, make a referral.
I understand in general, but I'm asking just a very specific question, and I would like an answer, yes or no,
that
with
is
the
your
greatest
time.
respect.
Mr. Cooper, that is your time. We will come back to you, I am sure. Mr. McCauley for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Witness, thanks for joining us. It's nice to see someone from Alberta, even if you are from Calgary. I want to ask, were you aware of these conflicts that were going on? Like, it was systemic. It wasn't like one or two that governance missed. Like, this was widespread systemic fraud being committed. You were a vice president, so high level. Were you aware of any of these?
So how I would be made aware is if there was a conflict declared, then I would be aware.
I asked that, were you aware of these conflicts?
So I was aware that there were conflicts that some board members had because they were declared conflicts.
And what did you do with that?
So in my role as a vice president ecosystems, I always did my best to manage these conflicts of interest and to ensure that the stewardships of public funds was done in the best way possible.
Were you aware
have to
that in the
say,
contribution agreement, it was required that the foundation report conflicts or perceived conflicts to the ministry or to the minister?
Yes, I was aware of that, and it was my understanding that there was a departmental liaison who had access to the board materials, including the minutes.
Right.
And
So
the conflicts would have
did
been
you, let
documented
me just ask again. So you were aware that they were required to be reported to the minister. Did you ever follow up on any of those to
was
ensure
not
that these conflicts were addressed?
I appreciate the question from the honorable member. It was not my responsibility to report those
I'm sorry,
conflicts.
you were a vice president, probably a public service, well-compensated vice president, and you didn't believe it was your job to report these. We had a whistleblower, and I'm sure you've read the testimony because you reported on it. He was not a high-level senior executive like yourself, but he had the bravery to come forward and try and stop this fraud. But yourself as a vice president, you didn't see it as your responsibility to follow up on this? Help me out here. Like,
It was
how?
my understanding these conflicts were reported into the department by us providing them with copies of the minutes of the board meetings, the materials from the board meeting.
Fraud went on for years. You just turned a blind eye. So you were aware. You said, okay, well, we reported it through minutes, but it continued for years. 400 million stolen from taxpayers. And yet, as a vice president, you did your job by sending along an email or sending along minutes and then walking away. Like, I'm just flabbergasted how this could happen. Well, I guess I don't have an answer.
I'm sorry,
You
I
said that
didn't
you-
hear a question. Was there
Okay,
a
I'm
question?
flabbergasted. How did you allow that to happen? Like, in what world does a vice president, a well-paid, well-compensated, well-pensioned vice president, not take any responsibility when taxpayers' money is being defrauded? I could see one off. If it happened once, okay, I saw the minutes went up the line, but this went on for years. Millions stolen for years. And you were aware, and you were a vice president, but it was like a shrug. Sir, I don't think I'm going to get a response. I'm going to turn my final minute over to Ms. Sinclair Desgagne.
Très bien, vous avez 1 minute 4 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Je vous donne- I'll give you another opportunity to answer the question. And I'll continue in the same vein as what Mr. McCauley has been asking. Not only did you not report either to the board or to the department these conflicts of interest, you were part of it because you yourself was hiring Mr. Wormold to do the assessments on applications that he himself had written. So do you not understand what a conflict of interest is? I'm asking you a clear question. Do you understand what a conflict of interest is?
Oui ou non?
Yes or no?
I certainly have strengthened my understanding of conflict of interest.
Quand vous avez
to
été engagé
ensure
en
that I
2016, est-ce que quand vous avez été engagé en 2016,
When you were hired in 2016, did you follow conflict of interest training? Did you follow the training? Did you take it?
Yes, I would have familiarized myself with the
Et
conflict
donc,
of
vous n'aviez
interest
pas
policy
compris
upon joining the organization.
avant le rapport de la...
And so before the Auditor General's report, you hadn't understood what conflict of interest was, even though you followed the training? It seemed normal to you that a person draft an application and then go over to SDTC to assess that same application? Does that seem normal to you? And not reporting this kind of behavior to the board so that the board approved the project without knowing that there was a huge conflict of interest within that project, does that seem normal to you?
So I'm going to have to say, like, all of these matters were thoroughly reviewed by the Auditor General. They've made a number of recommendations to strengthen the conflict of interest practices at SDTC. The Foundation has accepted all of those recommendations, and I'm certainly following the policies and practices that are in place.
Thank you very much. Suivant.
There are also claims that employees experienced a hostile work environment under your leadership. So were you aware of any concerns raised by staff about workplace culture?
I became aware, just give me a minute here, please, of the allegations against me when I began receiving anonymous emails, fraudulent emails that had been established in my name that contained many of the allegations that you were quoting today. That was how I was first informed of the allegations it made against me. It was very upsetting for me. I have never had anyone take my name and create anonymous email to be able to communicate broadly and publicly all of these allegations. Just take a minute.
Just maybe have a glass of water?
Yeah, I'll do that. I'm ready for the next question.
All right,
Okay,
Nietzsche,
so-
I'm afraid that is your time, and I was going to ask the same thing of
Okay.
the witness. Madame Kolbuc, yeah, take just a second, and I just want to double check that the next member will be asking questions in French. Just want to make sure you have the interpretation turned on.
I believe I have it correctly
Tell you what,
in place.
je vais demander question.
All right, I'll ask a question in French. Can you hear me in English now? Is it working properly? Yes. Okay, thank you.
We'll proceed to the next member, Ms. Kolbuc. Are you ready to go?
I'm ready.
Good. Thank you very much. Madame Desgagne, vous avez la parole pour 6 minutes.
Ms. Desgagne, you have 6 minutes. Good morning, Ms. Kolbuc. Thank you for being with us today. You have a reputation among some former employees in terms of managing public funds, as well as a way in which you interacted with your employees that is not necessarily positive. So let's go directly to specific allegations, and I'd like to have true answers, please, because I don't have a lot of time. The Auditor General reported that at least 2 projects in her sample were not eligible for the Ecosystem Fund. One of them was the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technology one. So if we look closer at that project, there are a lot of things that don't work at all. So not only is this project ineligible, on top of that, the consultant who practically wrote the application, Mr. Chris Wormold, was then paid by SDTC, therefore with public funds, to approve the application that he himself wrote. So you are the director of this fund, you approved it, and you made sure that this this was funded. So what do you say about that, please?
So what I'll say is that there were 2 projects that were approved by the former board of directors, including the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technology. I was asked by the former CEO to conduct due diligence on an application that SDTC received.
Madame Kolbuc, ma question était très précise. Comment tolérer...
Ms. Kolbuc, my question was specific. How do you tolerate that an external consultant wrote the application, and it even says it in them that Mr. Chris Arnold had helped them with the process, and that you then gave him the same mandate, $10,000, to assess his own application? It's a very specific question, and I'm not asking you to review the whole Ecosystem Fund. So how did you, as the director of the Ecosystem Fund, tolerate this kind of conflict of interest within your own team?
So I would have received the application from the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technology from the former CEO, and I was asked to conduct due diligence on that application with my team. The mandate of that project was to develop capacity amongst Indigenous entrepreneurs, as the foundation had not received any applications from companies led by Indigenous entrepreneurs. And the mandate of the project was to support.
Excusez-moi, Madame Kolbuc, vous ne répondez
I'm sorry, Ms. Kolbuc, you're not answering the question. You asked Chris Marlowe to do this assessment, to do an external one, which is mandated by the contribution agreement, and it was even mentioned in the application. And so I'm not challenging the work of this Institute of Technology. I'm challenging your role. So I'm going to the next question because I'm not getting an answer on this. Next question. The project, the Verschuren project, you received, you were part of the team that was mandated to follow up this stream, so there wasn't the possibility of having an online application. So you chose this project as a possible one. And when the employees raised their doubts about conflicts of interest, you said to them, and there were several people in the room, that you had done the necessary verifications with the board and the government, and that the conflicts were settled. However, when this project came up, well, then certain board members said, well, no, there's a clear conflict of interest. We cannot approve this project. So did you therefore lie to your employees, Ms. Kolbuc?
I would always speak the truth to my employees. So for this project, there was a perceived conflict of interest with the former chair. That conflict would be adjudicated by the former board of directors, and it was, and the project never was approved for funding.
Donc, je répète ma question.
So I repeat my question. When the employees raised the potential conflicts of interest, you mentioned, and there were several people in the room who heard this, who testified to this, and who can say this, that you told them that you had done the necessary due diligence and that there was no conflict of interest. Everything was fine. So the board rejected the project because there was such a flagrant conflict of interest. It's normal that the board would have said, look, there's a problem here. So first of all, you presented this thing to the board as if there was no conflict of interest. But on top of that, you said to your employees who had raised doubts that there was no conflict of interest, that you had done the necessary verification. So how do you explain that? I need an answer. I've asked you several questions, so please answer it. You haven't answered several of mine. How could you justify saying to your employees that you had done this verification? Were you wrong? Did you dream that you had done this? Because it seems very contradictory with the testimony of several people who were in the room when you said that you had done the due diligence about the conflict of interest.
I'm going to answer your question to the best of my ability. I don't know what meeting you might be talking about, so it's hard for me to verify what someone claims that I have said. Can share is that if there was a potential conflict of interest with the board of directors, it would be adjudicated by the board of directors. If the board had made a decision to fund that project, I would have been responsible in my role.
Attendez, vous êtes en train de me dire que les exécutants.
So you're telling me that the executives of SDTC have no obligation to follow the guidelines on the conflict of interest, that it's up to the board to decide if that's the case? Because it's your responsibility. I'm telling you, you're paid with public funds. It's your responsibility to ensure that there is no conflict of interest in the projects that you are funding, that you are responsible for. You are a senior official. It's not up to the board to decide, it's you.
So the Auditor General has highlighted that there were gaps in the governance and oversight of the Foundation in the management of conflict of interest. As the Foundation, we've accepted all of those recommendations, have put them in place, and are following those procedures as well. And they certainly have strengthened the management of conflict of interest within the Foundation.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup.